right on time, 4:30. Because it takes a bit of time for us to make this go live on Facebook.
Yeah.
It takes a few seconds. Yeah. All right, and we're live on Facebook, so I think we can begin. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. The webinar today is the third of 5 others that are hosted by A2K4D as part of our annual workshop. This year's workshop is titled Beyond COVID-19, Data, AI, and the Future of Work, Global Issues and Local Challenges. So in this webinar, we want to share some very exciting perspectives and the research of new and emerging researchers, or as we call them, NERGS, within the Open African Innovation Research Network, Open Air, and to also reflect on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it's had on their research and innovation in their areas and countries of study. Now, I myself am a NERG. I had the pleasure of joining the Open Air Network when I first came to the A2K4D Center in the summer of 2018. And as the North African node of Open Air, A2K4D currently works on some very exciting projects and research mapping the state of AI, data, and emerging technologies in the region, as well as the legal frameworks that regulate them, which we hope to be able to share very soon. But for now, I urge you all to please visit the excellent Open Air website to view some of our published work together. With that, just a few notes before we get started to avoid any mishaps throughout the webinar. The webinar is recorded, so please make sure you're muted throughout for as little disruption as possible. For our audience, video enabling is off for connectivity reasons, but you're welcome to turn it on if you like. And as for the Q&A, which will be towards the end of our meeting, please do ask your questions as they come to you. You don't have to wait until that point. You can do this in the Zoom chat box or as a Facebook comment, or just tweet them using our hashtag, hashtag A2K10 on Twitter. Also, please make sure to follow us and our lovely speakers for today, as well as the Open Air Network on Twitter for future events and updates. All right, so today we are delighted to host an exceptional panel, beginning with Nan Warner, a longtime partner of A2K4D and the Open Air Program Manager. Nan is an expert of higher education partnerships and donor organizations with particular specialization in designing and managing African academic partnership programs. We also have Caroline Wanjiru Muchiri, who is currently a research fellow in charge of implementing Open Air project objectives at the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law at Strathmore University. She also serves as the IP Research and IP Clinic Manager. Wanjiru is also a trainer and mentor at iBiz Africa, a business and entrepreneurship incubator at iLab Africa, as well as an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. We are also delighted to welcome Bontle Monnya, who is a postgraduate law student at the University of Cape Town and a research assistant at the IP unit, also at the University of Cape Town. Bontle is also a member of the Golden Key International Honor Society and serves as a law faculty mentor. So to start us off, I will give the floor to ATK4D's founding director and the Open Air co-principal investigator and metrics team leader, Professor Nagla. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Farah. Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to see our panelists today, Nan, Bontle, and Caroline, and thank you, Farah, for moderating. Allow me then to say a few words to welcome everyone. Just a few words about the Access to Knowledge for Development Center. We were established in February 2010. We're housed at the AUC School of Business. The center is a regional research center engaged in empirical and policy-oriented research in the area of knowledge, technology, and development in Egypt, the Arab world, and Africa. Our research serves to impact local policy making, bring the voice of Egypt and region and Africa to global scholarship and debates and discourse on these issues, and build capacity of young researchers in our parts of from our part of the world. This is our 10th annual workshop, which we are doing online for obvious reasons. But one of our most important roles and very dear to my heart is that, as Farah mentioned, we are the North African hub of the Open African Innovation Research Network partnership that has spanned for almost 10 years, with hubs in Cairo, Cape Town, and Johannesburg, Nairobi, and with our partners in Ottawa, as well as in Lagos, actually in Nigeria, and with researchers based in over 18 countries in Africa. Within our research at the Open African Innovation Research Network, we work on empirical, ground-up research, policy-oriented from the ground, from Africa. That's the most important thing. And locally, our research explores how knowledge governance policies can best ensure that social and economic benefits of innovation are shared inclusively. And globally, our network recognizes the seminal role of Africa in the global knowledge, innovation, and development discourse and policymaking. And we provide the voice of Africa in global policymaking on those fronts. And no better voice than the voice of youth. So I'm delighted to have our speakers today through our program at Open Air, the New and Emerging Researchers Group, which we have started in 2015, and we have housed for more than over 100 NERGs, as you know, some of whom are currently actively working with us, a few of whom have graduated on to further endeavors. And this is what building capacity is really about. So I want to also mention that this particular webinar is completely organized by our NERGs, and I'm very grateful to them. Farah Ghazal, our moderator, Adil Osama, under the supervision of Nadine Waheba, and in partnership and with the support of Dana Rajbishi and Khadija Hassan from our team. We also acknowledge Nagam, our first NERG since the start of the program in 2015. So in partnership within Open Air, we are grateful for the support of Canada's International Development Research Centre and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We're also grateful to the Queen Elizabeth Scholars scholarships that all of these support our NERGs in their research endeavors. And without further ado, I'm just going to thank again our speakers, Nan, Bontle, and Caroline, and Farah, and pass it on to Farah to start the session. And I really look forward to a wonderful discussion with everyone. Thank you again for giving me the floor to say a few words. Thank you. Farah, your turn.
Thank you for that, Dr. Nagla. Perhaps I could ask Nan to speak next.
Well, hello to everybody. And thank you so much to Nagla and her incredible team for giving us the opportunity to tell you about the Open Air NERG. And I personally find it really exciting to be able to reach such a widespread audience. Surely this is the future of conferencing, where one can speak directly to hundreds, if not thousands of people. Nagla has introduced the Open Air Network, our vision and our journey so far. In our theory of change, we identify 6 parallel agencies that produce results that combine to realize our ultimate goal of better lives. These are 1, an effective network structure and management system, 2, targeted research projects that are integrated and synthesized, producing better and appropriate academic ideas and tools. 3, strategic communication and dissemination of our research results and recommended government policy changes. 4, the cultivation of leadership abilities for now and the future. 5, research capacity building of existing and future researchers. And 6, building strategic networks and capacity. A consideration of these 6 agencies brought the open air leadership to the realization that mentorship and development of students and young researchers would be critical. It is also a major component of open air's sustainability. Nagla has mentioned our funding partners, IDRC, and since they offer funding primarily for research, Open Air approached the Canadian SSHRC for co-funding in order to award student and early career researcher assistantships and involve them at various levels in Open Air's work. That proved so successful that we then approached the QES and received further funding with slightly different conditions. And so the NERGS was born, the New and Emerging Researchers Group. They are selected from all levels of academia, including undergraduates, Juris Doctor, masters, and doctoral students, postdoctorates, and other research associates. Since 2015, our 6 institutional hubs, that is 5 in African countries and 1 in Canada, have attracted over 90 intelligent and enthusiastic NERGs. There are, of course, ongoing changes in the composition of the active NERG group because members come and go according to the dictates of their degree studies and the different academic years of the institutions. In addition to the hub-based NERGs, we have also been able to identify and fund dynamic young African researchers outside of our hubs. This has allowed us to proactively seek individual achievers in the Francophone countries, where Open Air has not yet managed to establish fully fledged institutional hubs. So now we are able to add a much needed Francophone voice to our research activities. My colleague Victoria Shaw, who's based at the University of Ottawa, is responsible for managing the SSHRC and QES grants. I'm responsible for managing the IDRC grant, and of course we work together all the time. The governance of the NERG is straightforward. The NERGs nominate their representatives in the form of a lead and a deputy. These normally hold their positions for a year. When the lead retires, the deputy takes over and another deputy is nominated. These 2 people represent the NERG on the Open Air Steering Committee, which meets quarterly. There is also an administrative facilitator, who is myself, who works closely with the lead and the deputy. We discuss the annual work plan, stay in touch with the current NERGs, engage with any issues arising, and report to the steering committee. In addition, new information is uploaded to the Open Air website, which increases the online visibility of the individuals. Once appointed, the NERGs immediately become part of the academic family of their mentor. They must submit a work plan for the duration of their appointment, and this becomes an informal contract between them and their academic mentors. They are expected to use research-related tools, analyze data, and where possible, co-author research papers. They should be active on relevant internet platforms, and they must participate in departmental activities and administration. The aim of all of this work is to develop skills such as research methods, teamwork, leadership, project management, and community engagement. To date, our NERGs have been engaged in a number of activities within the network, most notably research. Several have presented at international conferences, have published research, and have traveled. They have had networking opportunities, and some of them are in near daily contact across hubs as both colleagues and friends. These opportunities and lasting friendships are the intangible attributes that help to ensure later success, whether they remain a part of Open Air directly or become alumni. Open Air itself was founded on such relationships between scholars. Sadly, we lose touch with many of the NERGs once they leave university. However, we are certain that their experiences have helped to develop skills that they will use for the rest of their careers. Others continue with an academic career, and we are better able to monitor their progress. Some examples of how former NERGs are building a successful career in academia are Dr. Bram van Wiele. He is a former NERG lead and is now an academic staff member at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Dr. Alexandra Mogioros is an assistant professor of law at Ryerson University in Canada. Dr. Elvis Avenio is research officer at the Technology and Management Centre for Development at Oxford University in the UK. Nancy Salem is a research assistant at the Fair Work Project and a doctoral student at the Oxford Internet Institute. Tanvir Jiwa is the communications officer for the International Commissioner of Jurists, a reporter on international law in domestic courts for Oxford University Press, managing editor for the African Legal Information Institute, and a fellow of the Resolution Project. Dr. Desmond Oria-Kochba is a barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Nigeria and a lecturer in the law faculty at the University of Benin in Nigeria, and many, many more achievers and achievements. An important aspect of a NERG award is the possibility to travel. Funding is awarded when available and appropriate for a NERG to participate and present at a conference, travel to another country to work with another mentor and NERG, carry out research at grassroots level, and so on. Sadly, COVID-19 has put a stop to this, and we regret the lost opportunities because nothing is as important to the development of a person than experiential learning. We live in a world that seems increasingly divided, and the experience of another continent, country, and culture breaks down barriers and educates in a way that no distant engagement can. We hope that this aspect can be brought back as soon as possible for the sake of our future academic leaders. I'll now end this introduction to the NERG so that we can listen to two of our NERGs describing their research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nan. Wanjiru, can I ask you to go next?
Thank you, Farah. Thank you, Nan, for introducing the NAG program. I am privileged and I'm very happy to be part of the team at NAG. So my name is Caroline Wanjiru Muchiri. I currently am at the CPIT Strathmore University Center, which is the hub for open air in East Africa. My current research right now, we are focusing on innovation ecosystem in Kenya. From our interactions with Kenyans, we have found that Kenyans are quite entrepreneurial and quite innovative by themselves. And as part of our research, we are trying to find out how they are scaling the innovations that they are doing, and also how they are benefiting and reaping the benefits from their innovations. And also if these innovations are able to have an impact in the society that they are living in. So currently we are focusing on something we are calling social entrepreneurship, which is one mode of scaling innovations in Kenya. It is slightly picking momentum, especially in Kenya, mainly because of the factors contributing to the innovation ecosystem in Kenya. So social entrepreneurship is something that are entrepreneurs who are focusing more on the social impact of their work, as opposed to making or creating an economic benefit for themselves. In Kenya, currently, we have more than 100 or so innovation hubs, which are assisting startups in setting up their business models, in setting up their businesses, and eventually rolling out to the market. However, social entrepreneurship, they don't really have any legal framework currently. So they have to be registered and they have to be regulated under the existing legal framework, which somehow has not been beneficial to them because they are treated as profit-making entities. And where they are registered and treated as non-profit making entities, you find that sometimes they are having problems with their corporate governance and also their modes of getting to the market because of the charity mentality when they are approaching the society people. Also, we are focusing on the nature of innovations that the social entrepreneurship are trying to get to the market. From our previous research, we have found out that research in Africa and in Kenya generally is considered to be open, collaborative, and also open, collaborative, and it's also very fast, and it happens very fast, and it is, of course, in response to the societal needs in the specific countries. Now, with such nature of innovation, the applicable intellectual property laws that are in place becomes somehow unsupportive or somehow insufficient or inadequate to protect the innovations as they come. The question then happens to be, then how do the intellectual property frameworks that are already set up in these countries, in Kenya in this case, help the innovators reach the market while at the same time enabling the innovators reap the economic benefits of their innovations. We have since found out that Kenyan innovators really depend highly on trust, mutual trust between people, where one innovator will just simply have a sit down with another innovator and they discuss something, and then so what happens after that, at sometimes it becomes conflict because one person may proceed and and actually proceed and implement the innovation as they discussed without really having or without discussing the same with the previous person. So such is a collaborative nature of the innovation. However, at the same time, the innovators, all of them, it is necessary for them to be able to reap the benefit from the innovation. So the question for us we are asking is, what knowledge governance structures can we employ or can we implement as a country to assist our innovators to both benefit and continue collaborating the way they are collaborating, because those collaborative efforts and partnerships that they're having are actually assisting in either enriching the innovations themselves or in also in creating an impact or creating the resources that are required for them to be able to reach the market. So we are currently concerned with those knowledge structures, which comes from the point where an innovation is conceptualized, ideation stage, to the creation stage, up to the point where it is commercialized and in the market. So mainly that is our focus, and also we are trying to find out why social entrepreneurship is really peaking in the country, because we have several social entrepreneurs in Kenya, or entrepreneurs who are actually describing themselves as social entrepreneurs. And so the question is why they wouldn't opt to be just an ordinary startup and just proceed and describe themselves as a social entrepreneur. So some of those questions are going to be in our upcoming research papers. And despite the fact that there's COVID, we continue to do our bit on our end. And I look forward to more collaborative efforts again with my team, both at NAG and the steering committee. Thank you. Back to you, Farah.
Thank you so much, Wanjiru. We can now move to Bontle.
Thank you so much, Farah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to share my research project with you today, which is entitled The Effect of the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act on Rural Women Crafters' Intellectual Property Rights. So just a note for those of you who don't know, the Khoisan are the indigenous people of South Africa. Across South Africa, women have experienced great discrimination and inequality. For many years, the existence has been the site for oppression and male tutelage. the introduction of the Constitution profoundly impacted women's social, political, and economic rights. It ushered in a new system of life for women, one in which they are recognized and treated as equals to their male counterparts. And although progress has been made, the passing of the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act, hereon referred to as the TKLA, has threatened women's rights to harness the social and economic benefits of their work within the existing intellectual property regime. So there are various initiatives that have been undertaken to ensure the socioeconomic equality of women, both at national and international levels. At national level, we have the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities, which seeks to accelerate the socioeconomic transformation of women. South Africa has also ratified a number of gender-related agreements, such as the Convention on the Elimination on All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So when it comes to rural women crafters in particular, research has shown that arts and culture has become a form of empowerment and resistance. It plays an essential role in rural development and poverty reduction and serves as a pathway to preserving culture and heritage. So it is then important to ask the following question. When considering the nature of traditional leadership, is the TKLA compatible with rural women crafters' IP rights? And does it realize their emancipation and visibility? And to answer this, we of course have to look at the history of traditional leadership in South Africa. So it is often and still assumed that chiefs were dictators who possessed a concentration of unchecked powers. However, prior to colonization, there was no real concentration of power in chiefs, but rather a multi-layered way of rule. The relationship between the chief and his community was summed up in the saying, "A chief is a chief by the people." And this simply means that the power and influence of a chief came from the size of his community and therefore served as an incentive to serve justly. However, the institution of traditional leadership was distorted in the colonialism and apartheid era. This idea that a chief's legitimacy depended on people was done away with, as it was made clear that chiefs were recognized and legitimized by the government. The state had the power to appoint and remove traditional leaders. And this in turn meant that traditional leaders were no longer accountable to the people per se, but to the state, and had to administer state agenda in order to avoid removal from chieftaincy. So in essence, chiefs were granted significantly more power and authority than they've ever had before. So for example, Black South Africans were not allowed to leave their region without a permit granted by the chief. Furthermore, Black women were treated as perpetual minors under the guardianship of their husbands or fathers, and thus needed their permission to travel. Chiefs were authorized to allocate land and generally assigned it to men. Consequently, women could only gain secondary rights through their guardians. So subject to the colonialist government, male traditional leadership and guardianship, women struggled against structural violence and inequity, invisible and vulnerable even in their own homes. So it is no wonder that many called for the disbandment of traditional leadership at the dawn of democracy. In particular, the National Women's Coalition was concerned that retaining traditional leadership in the constitutional era would result in rural women continuing to be subject to patriarchy in the name of customary law. And despite opposition from many fronts to the recognition of traditional leadership, the final constitution made provision for it. And this was done through the passing of the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act, which sought to transform traditional leadership institutions in a manner that aligns with constitutional principles and restore the legitimacy and integrity of traditional leadership. So the Framework Act makes provision for the establishment and recognition of traditional councils. It requires that the composition must have 1/3 of women, 40% of the council must be democratically elected, whilst the rest of the 60% may be appointed by a traditional leader. Traditional councils were given 7 years to meet this requirement. However, by 2018, which is 15 years later, after the act was passed, only a minority of traditional councils had met this transformation requirement. And to make matters worse, the act is silent on the consequences of non-compliance. And although the act is meant to set out the role of traditional leaders, there's great uncertainty as to what their role actually is. It is then perhaps fair to conclude that the Framework Act has failed to meet its purpose of restoring traditional leadership and its legitimacy. It is therefore against this backdrop that many traditional leaders have mobilized and continue to appeal for a clarification of their role. And this movement took momentum when Khoisan communities and their leaders appealed for their recognition, and these appeals were sought to be addressed by the passing of the TKLA. The TKLA repeals and replaces the Framework Act entirely. It ostensibly aims to solve problems that existed in the Framework Act. It makes provision for election and gender composition requirements, and these are exactly the same listed as those listed in the Framework Act. However, once again, there are no real consequences for compliance, despite statistics which show that over 15 years later, only a minority of traditional councils had met the transformation requirements. But perhaps the most controversial provision in this act is Section 24, which gives traditional leaders the power to contract with mining companies, property developers, or anybody else without the prior informed consent of the indigenous community. So instead of consulting and seeking the consent of those affected, the TKLA seems to prioritize consultation with powerful elites within the traditional leadership institution. There's this great concern that the TKLA's silence on the issue of consent will have an adverse effect on the IP rights of indigenous communities and consequently the IP rights of rural women crafters. This would undermine significant legal developments in IP which seek to recognize and protect indigenous knowledge. Under the Intellectual Property Laws Amendment Act and the IKS Act, obtaining the prior informed consent of an indigenous community is a key requirement. Now, it might be argued that traditional communities are given a voice through representation by the traditional council. However, as mentioned, these councils are largely untransformed and there's been little compliance with statutory regulations to ensure transformation, and much more importantly, to ensure that women are given roles within these structures. So this exclusion of consent as a requirement is in direct juxtaposition to rights granted in IP laws, which provide that prior informed consent should be obtained before any deals are negotiated and concluded. The fact that agreements to use the work of rural women crafters could be entered into without their consent could possibly stifle innovation and creativity. This will harm the efforts of IPLA and the IKS Act, which provide protection and commercialization for rural women crafters' indigenous knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. And history has shown us that traditional leaders have a propensity to undermine participatory decision-making, even where it is required by legislation. And this is especially found in cases that deal with informal land rights. So through craft making, rural women are creating status and visibility for themselves and their indigenous knowledge, while simultaneously deriving an income for themselves and gaining financial freedom. It is thus essential that rural women crafters are guaranteed control over their work in that they're able to grant or deny consent. The functions of traditional leaders under the TKLA are thus not compatible with rural women crafters' IP rights, because in granting traditional leaders greater powers, the TKLA denies women the power to assert their intellectual property rights. Indigenous South African women have had to maneuver within two structurally patriarchal systems of power that men, both African and white, continuously fought to maintain through customary and statutory law. And what the TKLA does is to once again subject rural women to a patriarchal system of power wherein men, i.e. traditional leaders, can take decisions concerning the IP of rural women crafters without their consent. So once again, instead of transforming traditional leadership to align with constitutional values and restoring its legitimacy, it gives traditional leaders far-reaching powers which will yield detrimental consequences for indigenous communities. So it is thus essential that when Parliament drafts and implements legislation, they do so in a manner that considers the historical position of rural women, as well as the value of work that they engage in. As a popular saying goes, God helps those who help themselves. In this case, rural women crafters are empowering themselves and their communities. Their actions show self-initiative and agency. Therefore, legislation should not undermine these efforts, but seek to strengthen them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bontle, and thank you to all of you for this fascinating insight and information. Perhaps we could go a little bit more in depth, and you could tell us, maybe this question for Wanjiru, exactly how has the pandemic affected or impacted the innovation ecosystem in your country or in the communities or areas that you are researching and working with? Or how have the entrepreneurs in your country navigated the pandemic? Everybody else is welcome to comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Farah, for that. So I would say that the pandemic has had both positive and negative impact on the ecosystem, and especially on young innovators. We have seen innovators who are currently and who continue to struggle to really keep their innovations alive, especially for those innovators who are somehow at the point of scaling out or rolling out their projects to the market, especially before the month of March. It is quite challenging for them. And however, despite that being the case, Kenyans, as I mentioned, we are still highly innovative and entrepreneurial. And one of the key responses that we have seen in the pandemic, during the pandemic, are some of the modes of scaling innovations have slightly changed, and also the type of innovations originating from Kenya and from the Kenyan innovators have also slightly deviated from the ordinary linear or non-linear development that we were seeing before the pandemic. And some innovators have taken this opportunity to really reinvent the wheel and also reinvent themselves as well as reinvent how their innovations are going to get to the market. They have quickly learned how to digitize their work and also the implementation plans for their innovations and their businesses. And most businesses also have had to adapt to digitizing purchases and delivery of goods and services. Currently, I would say we have innovators or entrepreneurs who are actually doing home delivery, something that was not there before, and something that is currently greatly supported by the fact that Kenya has a mobile money platform that in the beginning of the pandemic, the government waived some transfer fees that were applicable between one person to another when sending money. And that has seen an uptick, a great uptick to the way the people have adopted to purchasing and selling goods over the online platform. And also our government has an online portal really that is dedicated to every citizen, Kenyan citizen and residents. And here the government has been able to support or somehow provide some level of support, resources support for the businesses who are able to register their businesses online, something that was not there before. Well, it was there before the pandemic began, but the uptake of the services has really risen. And that is something that is commendable, because we have seen innovators who would have come to SIPIT for IP, to the IP clinic to get some level of support. Now we are seeing that some of these innovators actually proceeding to the online portal, doing that for themselves, and then coming back to just for some clarification or some assistance on how to go about it, which is really a good thing. The nature of innovations, as I mentioned, have also somehow changed or improved. We have really not stopped or paused our innovative culture. And we have seen that most of the innovations that are currently very upfront are mainly in the health sector. Again, the pandemic has brought us to a point where we have to be at home, and these innovations have start from the very young age, young members of the society, children actually, all the way to university students and to the people who are in the market. I would give an example of where we had hands-free hand washing station that was, it's an innovation that I don't want to use the term invented, but it was fabricated, or it was made by an 8-year-old boy who is in a rural area somewhere close to the Kenya-Uganda border, a place called Busia. And also we saw Kenyatta University students designing a ventilator from the resources that they had. And all these are efforts to who are directed towards health efforts for creating personal protective equipment. All of them are definitely a positive sign on the growth of our ecosystem in Kenya. And the solution, as I mentioned again from our research, I think this is also going to be forming part of our outcome in the current project, is that how then do we assist these innovators to ensure that these innovations are scaled and they reach the market, and they also reap the economic benefits of these innovations. Mainly because the innovators, as they are, what their focus, their number one focus is not to seek intellectual property protection, which is ideally how the research process should go before a product is released to the market. So what we are seeing is that when an innovator, for instance, would come up with a design of a face mask, we have very creative designs in Kenya. Some of them are made, especially the ones that are made from fabric, different designs. The question then for them is, how does this mask get to the person who is supposed to use it? Their first question is not to get IP protection for whatever it is that they have. And this is how and why the research that we are currently undertaking would somehow address or assist in creating or recommending models within the law that can be implemented either by the innovators themselves or even with the government system, as we are yet to see, so that the innovators are able to scale their innovations comfortably and also reap economic benefits from the same. One last thing that I would like to mention is that we have an increase in the number of, again, the social entrepreneurs and the startups that I mentioned. And all these are actually somehow, most of them are actually digitized. However, the physical delivery of the goods and of the physical goods creates a challenge, because the goods have to move from point A to point B. And again, this has seen the introduction and rise of something we are seeing that as temporary storage facilities, which are operating as postal offices or postal services, where people will just go and deliver their goods, the people who are selling, and the person who is coming to collect or who has bought the goods over an online platform, they will then go and collect it here, keeping minimal or without any interaction with the sellers. And again, this is again in compliance with our Ministry of Health regulations that have been issued. So we continue to see some of these benefits, and then again with the government economic reliefs that are being used to encourage people to continue with their businesses, and the stimulus processes, projects and benefits that will be coming up. It's something that we are currently just examining to see how it goes. Lastly, but definitely not least, our government has introduced, or a senator, Nairobi senator called John Sakaja, he has introduced a startup bill which is aimed at assisting techpreneurs, startup which are in tech business, to somehow scale and support the incubators and innovations hub in Kenya. Well, this bill has just gone through the first reading, and it is expected to have a second reading, I think, in the coming month. It's something that we see as a legislative intervention by the government or by the state to really continue supporting the innovation ecosystem in a positive way. that would be all from me right now. I would hand it back to Farah.
Thank you so much for that. In answering that, you mentioned policy recommendations and how important they are for navigating something like a pandemic, as well as legislative interventions by the government. So I want to maybe take it from there and ask, and this question is for everybody, all our panelists, what capacities would you identify as necessary for navigating something like the pandemic, and what comes after the pandemic in terms of the aftermath? Or what capacities would you highlight as capacities that have helped the country adapt to the challenges that were posed by COVID-19? You could name 3 or your top 3 recommendations, if you like. So who would like to begin?
I can
Great,
go.
Nan, please go
I have
ahead.
no idea how to raise my hand electronically, so I'll just mention quickly. In South Africa, we've experienced something quite interesting, especially in the Western Cape, and started in Cape Town. This came as a result of a group on Facebook that was started by a Cape Townian. And so his initiative started what we call the Community Action Networks, or the CANs. Now, understand that particularly in this country, there is still a lot of separation, and even more particularly in Cape Town, the Cape Town area, because we sit on a peninsula and there's a limited number of people who can move onto that peninsula. So the new suburbs and a lot of the poor people have moved into squatter camps, basically, outside of the peninsula. Now, those have been designated as suburbs, but many of them are extremely poor. And what the Community Action Networks did was to pair a rich suburb, such as the one I live in, with a really poor one. And this is completely a grassroots social network. But we started off by just actually sharing food. So the Rondebosch Council would get together with the Bontle Council, and the Rondebosch people would provide food or money to buy food. And then council members at Bontle would feed the people who had nothing to eat. This is developing in a very interesting way because people are beginning to say now, well, when the pandemic ends and we all get back to so-called normal, we can't stop doing this. It has been such an effective initiative that we want to continue. And there's no reason why everybody in a suburb shouldn't contribute enough money to offer laptops or internet access to children and families in this case, Bontle. So this is something that's got nothing to do with government, which is basically bankrupt, but it is a very interesting initiative that has a lot of potential, and especially through the internet, to help educate and allow people to get jobs.
Thank you, Nan. Bontle, can you please go next?
Thank you. So just building on what Nan has said, South Africa has had one of the strictest and longest lockdown periods. And of course, due to this, a lot of businesses have had to close and thus suffered a huge financial strain. So the extensive government and private sector measures that have been put in place to save firms and help employees in the small business sector, which combined to over 6 billion Rand to date, which is equivalent to over 360 million US dollars. This is great. However, many small businesses and entrepreneurs have struggled to get funding, as a lot of the funding measures require businesses to be registered or tax compliant. And this would, of course, affect people such as the rural women crafters who I write about in my research. The other issue is that funding information is sometimes not easily available, and there are also long waiting periods between between the funding application and when the funding is actually granted. So I think that in future, it would be a step in the right direction if application requirements are less stringent, and that funding information is made more accessible and also made available in all official South African languages, that is, yeah.
Thank you, Bontle. Caroline, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you. Somehow, sorry, I was actually texting on the group chat, answering a question by one Mahmoud. Yes, yes, and yes, there are definitely some efforts that can really help, and some of the issues that we see are as we have lockdowns. In Kenya, there was nothing like the pairing up that Nan mentioned. So most efforts were really led by charitable organizations who are actually contributing into availing some of the needed resources to the most needy communities in the country. But still, one key thing that remains is that most of our the highest numbers in terms of the infected people continue to be in the urban areas as opposed to the rural areas. So we saw our government actually implement a curfew or limitation into the movement from people from urban areas to the rural areas, especially because the rural areas is where our elderly people live, and that somehow, I would say, really helped because the mass movement would have actually made the situation worse. However, we have currently recently removed all the curfews, other than I think a nighttime curfew that is applicable up to 11 p.m. at night. So which means there is little or no movement at night. And one of the things that we notice is how the human need to have some level of connection with their people. And another thing that we have seen is the fact that we have had an increased number of internet connectivities around the country, and that really has helped, because it's one of the ways that people have been able to keep in touch even when they are in the urban and the rural areas. So the question then for me that I keep asking myself is how what happens after the pandemic? We have school children resuming school. The question is, how do we economically bounce back to what we were before? I don't know whether it is necessary for us to get back there, but it is definitely something that we need to consider. We are looking forward to the economic stimulus packages that would be introduced by the state. Again, I am not sure what they will be. There are some tax breaks that employees, for instance, were enjoying. Currently, before the pandemic, employees would pay 30% income tax on their salary. That was reduced to around 25%. And also the VATable goods was reduced by around 2%. But still that affected the government earnings. So we don't know, we are still somehow not quite sure of what the responses that the government will be giving in the coming time.
Thank you, Wanjiru, and thank you to all three of you. If we could commence the Q&A section of this session with maybe Mahmoud's question, actually, if maybe Wanjiru, you'd like to elaborate on your response to him.
Yeah, I think he was asking about what is let me see, what has been one of the biggest exposures that from an macroeconomy perspective that the pandemic has exposed. And I think one of the things that we have seen is that we have very serious economic gaps between the rich and the poor, such that in Kenya, especially when we had the first lockdown, there are people who are able to continue living or containing themselves in their houses. they are able to work from home, for instance, they are able to stay at home. However, there are other people on the other hand, who can actually not be able to stay at home, mainly because of the structural and the infrastructure that they have. Some of them include the people who live in the slum area, and also the people who would live from what we call less than $1. But I have personal reservations for saying less than $1, but still that the rate of unemployment, the lack of alternative income generation activities for some people is very high, and it is very visible right now, such that necessitated charitable institutions to actually step in and continue supporting the people in the slum areas. And one of the structural things that maybe the state, I would think that the state would provide, is to have a sustainable way for everyone to be able to have some economic activity, that they are able to get an income, however small, that they are able to sustain themselves in a life that they are in. And that's one of the things that we continue to see up to date. We have middle income earners who are in full-time employment, who have had to move from one city to another, actually from the capital city, which is Nairobi, to other areas in the country, simply because they could not manage to continue sustaining their lives in Nairobi. And that for me is a serious challenge, because that means that that person is unable to sustain their current lifestyle, minus the employment that they have, which is, and then the employment again will depend on the employer, who will again be dependent on the state for some level of support, especially during the pandemic. Yeah.
Oh, thanks a lot, Wanjiru. Unless anyone else would like to comment on that question, I am seeing a question that is for Bontle, that has a gender element in it. It's about whether or not there has been a gender dimension to the impact that the pandemic has had on South Africa, or if you care to comment on the region as a whole.
Okay. Yes, of course. I think my answer would be a more broad one, and not necessarily like gender specific, but I think that, well, from my perspective, this period has been particularly challenging for me as a woman, but I can imagine for many other researchers as well, because due to libraries being closed, we've been unable to access textbooks, which we would have otherwise had access to if the libraries were open. And there were some textbooks which were made available online, but at a fee. So I think it is, important, and it would be a step in the right direction if South Africa actually passed the Copyright Amendment Bill, as it makes provision for flexible and progressive copyright exceptions, so that in future myself and other researchers are able to access what was previously an inaccessible community of scholarship. So yes, not directly linked to women per se, but I guess it affects everyone. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Bontle. I see that we're unfortunately running out of time. So if I could ask each one of you to say a concluding thought or any remarks that you have to leave us with. Perhaps we could start with Nan.
Well, it's been absolutely wonderful and a real privilege and a pleasure to be part of this discussion. And thank you again to Nagla and the astonishing team at the AUC. And may we have many more. I think that this is our future. And I do think that groups of people coming together from such different perspectives and different cultures can really make a difference in our discussions and the way forward.
Thank you, Nan. Wanjiru, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Thank you, Farah. Thank you for the opportunity to present our work in progress. And the question about how the pandemic has affected research is one of the things is that it is, I don't know about the rest of the researchers, but it is not really easy working from home, containing yourself at home, noting that there is little interaction with other people. Somehow that stimulates more ideas when you're talking to people. And this conference really helps because this interaction, I wouldn't have had it yesterday because we did not have such an interaction yesterday. So I am quite grateful for the opportunity and for the organizers for the opportunity to present some of our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wanjiru. Bontle, could you go next?
I echo what has been said. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this webinar. I'm so glad to be part of the NERGS. I've been able to, access a whole community of researchers, which I'm grateful for, and just look forward to interacting with everyone else more. Thank you.
Thank you, Bontle. Dr. Nagla, perhaps you want to say a few words before we end?
Thank you very much, Farah. I want to thank everyone, Nan, Bontle, Caroline. It's a pleasure to listen to you and to realize the importance of listening to young voices. Nothing like working with young people. I just want to take a couple of minutes to again acknowledge the gratitude that I have to work with Open Air and with the NERGS program. I know that in the audience, we have one of our NERGS who graduated, actually, Yumna Hashim, who has moved on to do an MSc in Digital Society at the University of Edinburgh. So hi, Yumna. I'm also acknowledging Toby Schumbetter from Open Air. He's not a NERG, but he's a colleague and longtime collaborator. I also want to mention another NERG of ours, Steph Felsberger, who moved on also to do a PhD at the University of Cambridge. I mean, I look at you and look at everyone else who's in this program, and I'm very, very proud. I listened to you, I learned from you. So I really want to thank you all. I want to thank Farah, another NERG of ours who has run this very, very well, I must say. My gratitude goes to, again, the AUC School of Business who hosts us. But I also want to thank, again, members of the team by name. So most of whom are NERGs. So I want to thank Nadine Waheba, Nagam Al-Husami, Gina Al-Ash'ar, Abdelhamid Tawfiq, our probably youngest member of the team, who's on his way to being a NERG as well. Adel Usama, Farah Ghazal, Dana Al-Bashbishi, and Khadija Hassan. What remains for me is to thank my audience as well, everyone who has participated in this. Thank you all so very much, and I hand it to you, Farah. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Nagla. So this was a delightful experience for me as a NERG and an Access to Knowledge for Development researcher. It was a pleasure having you all on this exceptional panel. And I also would like to extend my thanks to the audience for tuning in and for their questions. So take care, everybody, and be well until we meet face to face soon, hopefully.
Soon, hopefully.
Just a quick word. I want to say thank students who are on the team. And Mahmoud is one of my students. I'm very proud of his question. But students in the audience, thank you so much for tuning in.
All right.
Thank you.